All right, Mr. Rittenhouse. Okay, thanks. Oh, just got a message from Dr. Hall. He'll be joining us in a couple minutes, so I'll do the overview, and then by the time he logs on, so we've got board members, Mrs. McKittrick and Miss Autry, Superintendent James, and myself on the call. Thanks to all those who are joining in as well. Today's Finance Committee has an overview of high-level overview on ed choice under our legislative topics. Then we're going to be taking a little bit deeper dive into district-wide financial information and how the CARES Act, both revenue and expenses, budget year-to-date. We will be talking a little bit more specifically about our annual medical insurance update. And even though it's been a goal of ours to go to unit level analysis, when we came together.
Hey, Ryan, it's Derek.
Hey, how are you? Welcome.
Yeah. Apologies. Yeah, I just had I got off another board call that ran over a few minutes, so my apologies.
That's okay. We're just going live now.
Okay.
So we're starting at a high level, and I won't repeat that, but I am going to jump right into the legislative update in terms of the discussion the board's had regarding ed choice and try to provide a framework for the board. I did also attend Friday a statewide call on the matter with education associations, lobbyists, an attorney who is going to be very involved on behalf of a school district. And then today I talked to Bill Phyllis, who is the executive director of the Ohio Coalition for Equity and Adequacy. And Bill has been around through all 4 of the DeRolf court cases. And so I'll give you an update. It is just kind of the next step. I don't think you will have enough information as to join a potential lawsuit or not, but I can kind of give you some of the requests and deadlines that were embedded in the request for, hey, please join our cause by the end of June. So I am going to do some presentation of materials now. And I want to make sure everybody sees this. Does everybody see ed choice?
Yeah.
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, great. Let's zoom in on that. So just a quick overview of ed choice for the board. It's a scholarship program that was originally capped or had been growing in cap up to 60,000 state-funded scholarships. And there's both an income component and a performance component. And as you know, which was very hotly debated in both the House and the Senate and amongst school districts, was after July 1st in this year's biennium budget, there are some components in there that dramatically increased the performance component and including previous years as part of the calculation. And without going into much detail further than that, because I think the board well knows that it was potentially catastrophic and reported as such, that the expansion of it, which in the 11th hour was put on a stay, would have increased our numbers by hundreds, if not 500 or more students. And so that's what many districts approach the legislature, and ultimately the House version is where we are at with an expanded list of school districts. And to Dr. Akbar's question at the board meeting was how many school buildings are included. It is 700 statewide. And for Akron Public Schools, it went from 27 last year to 34 this year. Now, the specific numbers of our buildings hasn't changed much, but the performance component, which is no longer included as of right now, that frankly, that fight will take up again in February, could increase those numbers by hundreds. So again, to recap, 34 buildings of ours qualify right now. We have around 1,750 students on the Ed Choice Scholarship list. Let me bring up a spreadsheet to show you. Does everybody see that list?
Yeah.
What's not included in here is you see the K-8 separated and the 9-12 and 19 to 20. What's not included in here is autism and the John Peterson Scholarship as well. So just purely Ed Choice, you can see the potential increase on us is just shy of $1 million. And this is under the current law. If we were to go back to the expanded performance language, which is what will be hotly debated between now and February of next year, those could be those increases can be turned into 500 or more, $4 million plus or more. If you remember correctly, one of our local media outlets interviewed a school during this expansion time, and one school alone had over 200 potentially qualified students that have never attended Akron Public Schools that could accept this voucher. Now, obviously, in the 11th hour, that was removed. So that's what we're going to be following, debating, and lobbying the General Assembly on our behalf. Whether we join a coalition or lawsuit or not, that's what we're going to be advocating for.
Hey, Ryan.
Please.
Hey, Ryan, just I have a clarification question. I thought that there was, and maybe you said this previously, that the state had basically, in 2019, they had basically capped what our funding was. So we lost. So, I think one of the conversations we had was, with the COVID situation, and we saw an increase in kids going from charter schools to APS, that wouldn't necessarily benefit us because the state had basically sort of put a cap on, which is a benefit, for districts who are losing students, but it's a detriment if you're gaining students. So my clarifying question was, in this analysis, looking at the Ed Choice students, if we saw an increase in Ed Choice utilization, hypothetically, would that impact what our take was from the state, or is that stable because of the cap that you mentioned in 2019?
Great question. So the transfer of those dollars, when we have increased choice options out, that is what's called a below the line deduction. So we get our state funding at the top, and then we have a below the line deduction. There's no question about it. That transfers about $6,000 or just shy of the $6,000, which is the average per pupil revenue dollar amount that the state gives us. And no doubt that that is a detractor. You're also correct in saying we were growing for the previous 3 school years, where a lot of our choice students, not more live births, meaning we don't have a growing number of students in Akron, but more choice students were coming back to us. And in that circumstance, yes. As of this year, the new biennium, every district was frozen and or guaranteed. So if your student population base is growing, you are not getting additional revenue. Now, most urbans are in a declining enrollment scenario with very few of us, Akron, Columbus growing a little bit in students. We're not getting additional revenue for those students. Obviously, it hurts the growing districts. There's some that are growing much faster than us, like in Olentangy. On the downside, on the other side of that, obviously, goes without saying, if you're a heavily declining in enrollment, you're better off under this funding mechanism. So it is a very interesting point that we are being harmed at two levers of this financial equation. One, we're not getting additional revenue for the students that have been returning back to us. And two, we're getting the transfer out of additional students. And come February for next year's application, if we go back to the full performance component of this application, it could be 500 or more students and millions of dollars.
So Ryan, current state then. So current state, again, I apologize for sort of re-asking this question,
No,
but just to make sure I follow it. But current state, if a student chooses, so if a student opts for ed choice in the current frozen budget, that would not cost us any additional dollars. Is that right?
no, because it's
Okay.
below the line.
Below the line, okay.
It is a deduction.
Okay, gotcha. So basically, we can't benefit from people coming back to us, but we could still lose on students who are new students who are ed choicing out.
That's correct.
Okay, or open enrolling out to other districts like Coventry or Carter Falls.
That's correct.
Okay, I got you. Thank you. I appreciate the clarification.
Thank you. So I'll put together, following this, I'll finish the ed choice conversation with where we left it with Bill Phillis and the potential lawsuit. And then I will put together an educational packet for the board prior to next Monday, just the next day or two. So there's an overview responsive to the board as terms of the number of districts, how many buildings statewide, how many buildings that we qualify for, and the potential risk in the future as this expands. I did talk to Bill Phillis today. The deadline for the June was so that a consortium could approach the courts about a restraining order, about any additional or the current funding mechanism, about saying to the courts and having the courts rule that you can't take any additional money of ours, or you can't take any related to ed choice because this is an unconstitutional process. From talking about it, talking to Bill Phillis about this process is just growing. It's just getting off the ground, so to speak. He made mention of a number of districts that have signed on. It is not in the dozens. It's probably less than 12. I explained to Mr. Phillis that we will be exploring this, explained that as a large district and as a potentially one of the only large districts in litigation, that we could bear significant costs for those districts were a fraction of our size. And I also think we ought to see what the legislature is going to do over the next few weeks and months. That being said, I also would like to have the Ohio 8 kind of get an opportunity through the superintendent to report back to the board too, as I know they're going to be taking a look at this. So more information to come, but outside of the June date, as we the merits of joining a lawsuit, I think there's some time for us to gain additional information.
Okay, so that's what I was going to ask too, is where that puts us in terms of a discussion on whether or not we join. And I think you addressed a little bit of the timeline question, because they almost made it sound like it may be difficult if we wanted to join later. But it sounds like, and by the way, Eric Resnick and I have been playing a little bit of phone tag. He doesn't have voicemail on his phone. Maybe he gets a lot of calls, but I just want to make sure that at least I understand your recommendation as to right now is the deadline is more self-imposed. It sounds like there's still an opportunity for us to join later if we want to, barring any legal issues with us joining. And so your recommendation is let's get some more information from the Big 8, and let's hold a little bit. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, that would be my recommendation. There was also on the call on Friday that the question was asked of the statewide associations and lobbyists, if districts were to join a lawsuit, would their voice be detracted from in front of the General Assembly? And that was a definitive yes answer, meaning you may or may not have the influence that you want with the legislature and individual representatives and lawmakers if you join a lawsuit, knowing that that could potentially polarize the situation. There's more to follow with that conversation as well.
Oops, sorry.
No, there's more to follow with that conversation. This debate that we're having conversation is what districts all over Ohio are having, whether or not to join, whether or not to advocate through their representatives. But I can tell you the performance measurement stopgap that went through the 11th hour and was removed was all done through advocacy efforts, not through any threat of litigation.
So, and with all that being said, I guess since it's a committee, I don't want to be the sole person kind of making that decision, but I think
You're muted.
I'd love to hear what, if Derek, sorry, no, my phone rang, so it muted me automatically. Sorry. I don't want to be the sole person kind of making that call, and it is a committee. So I'd love to hear if Derek and Diana agree that I think what you're asking is probably reasonable. And it sounds like the approach other districts are taking is let's get some more information here before we get in a lawsuit with the state and find a lot of our other efforts going by the wayside.
There is time. Yes.
Well, I think, yeah. I mean, I think that makes sense to wait. I think the other, well, there are probably multiple other things to weigh, but the other thing I'm wary of too is, we all saw where DeRolf got us, right? I mean, how many millions of dollars were spent on the DeRolf litigation, and so I know someone would make the policy argument that, but for the lawsuit, that we wouldn't have seen the changes that we've seen made, right? So I think people would agree that there have been some movement in the right direction. I don't know that I would agree with that, but again, to your point, Ryan, I think as well, Patrick, before we kind of get embroiled and pot committed, if you will, to being a part and party to a lawsuit like this, short answer is yeah, I agree. I think we ought to wait.
Yeah, I would say so too. And I actually have a comment/question. So, you spoke about advocacy and our influence. So this coming from that PTA perspective, like I always do, that's a big part of what PTA does. And I'm just wondering or thinking out loud that maybe we should make some intentional efforts to educate our families so that they can assist us in whatever's on the table when it comes to legislation. I know when I went to the Ohio School Board Association 101, the very first training, at that time, they even mentioned that all the calls that they received were very helpful, I think, with that stopgap piece that you just mentioned. So I just want to see us use our tools in the toolbox. And I think if we educate our families on these issues, they can be helpful in whatever it is that we're needing to get done. So no matter if we join a lawsuit or not, we should be using that toolbox that we have.
So Diana, I had a question for you. I mean, so really to your point, and I apologize. I probably should know the answer to this, and I don't. Is there any sort of state? I'm sorry, like state sort of national state PTA sort of council? I mean, like again, I know that you were the president of the council here for about 10, 11 years. Is there anything that exists on a regional or state level that where there's sort of a state PTA group that we could partner with?
Absolutely. First of all, we're worldwide. Ryan and Dr. James can probably answer even better because they sit in on a lot of those meetings, and I'm sure the state PTA has had a presence at some point in time, I would think. But yes, to answer your question, there's a state and federal level of PTA that, you know, is actively engaged in a lot of things. And it's up to each individual PTA council or unit how engaged they are. Sometimes I just think it's a hidden gem and tool that we don't utilize as much as we could, you know.
Gotcha. Thank you.
The advocacy efforts that you talk about, Ms. Autry, were well noticed around the ed choice conversation and the ultimate delaying of the increased number of buildings. So to Derek's point, right, DeRolf in the 4 unconstitutional declarations moved very slow, and some would argue a frozen formula is probably, and ironically, a perfect place to debate that again. But I've never seen movement on a subject like ed choice as fast as it was. Now, unfortunately, it was taking money away from public K-12, which is what got people motivated. But that voice was heard loud and clear. And I remember attending those sessions up until 11 p.m. Saying we can't do this to our school districts. And here are hundreds of individual testimonies to that. So we will need that for sure, regardless of a lawsuit, and even started to think about and share Friday on our Ed Choice Task Force, individual board members, PTA, just not the superintendent and treasurer testifying. So we might be able to expand that voice for sure. I appreciate that. So I'll put together an educational.
Last thing, it would be great too if one of you guys then would include this on your report out so we can educate the rest of the board on what the committee's thinking.
Okay. I'll type up the notes and the educational support documents for you and the rest of the board prior to the next board meeting. Great. All right. Next item is really a district-wide financial information, very high level. And we talked a little bit about unit level analysis, which obviously with the post in COVID, we're not really into tracking unit level analysis because we're not at school. But I do have some granular information to share with you today. But let's start at a high level. Up until, I would say, a few weeks ago, many districts, including the Ohio 8, were counting on a 10% or greater reduction in school district budgets. As we got closer through the month of May, we started to see and hear from various parts in Columbus that the statewide tax collection on non-auto sales, personal income tax, and any other business tax were coming in better than expected. And we revised our conversations. Now, none of us have resubmitted our forecast yet because we're waiting for those numbers. We've revised that conversation to about 3 to 5% budget reductions from a 10% or greater. We're not just doing that alone. We're including statewide associations, colleagues, previous Department of Taxation folks. There's a report from the Hannah News Service by Dr. Howard Fleeter that talks about the finances through May. And I think that conversation is substantiated, as well as there's been more references from the governor and the Office of Budget Management that school districts are a very large employer. They're an economic engine and essential service. And another round of the unemployment claims, which, by the way, for the previous 11-week period filed May 30th, there were 1.3 million unemployment claims. That's more than the total number of unemployment claims for the last 3 years. So if some of the largest employers for our 612 communities were to go through a 10% budget reduction, you can imagine what kind of economic impact that could have. So again, much thanks to the federal stimulus dollars and them being put to work in some of our largest employers, let alone an essential service like K-12. The national unemployment rate, if you've been following, is between 13 and 14%, and Ohio's is approaching about 17%.
Hey, Ryan, can you repeat those numbers one more time?
Nationally, the unemployment rate is between 13 and 14%. And Ohio's unemployment is about just under 17%.
Yeah, so I had a question about that. So I saw that there was an article that came out a couple of days ago, I think it was in Forbes, that talked about an error in the methodology as related to how they were computing unemployment. I think they were off by I think the Labor Department was off by 4.9 million people that they basically just didn't account for appropriately. That impacted those numbers as well. And then the other thing that's always misleading about unemployment rates is that that's not taking into account people who no longer qualify for unemployment either. It's looking at folks who are drawing unemployment, not those whose unemployment has run out. They're not counted as being unemployed. That's the other thing. So to your point, those numbers are probably much higher than that 13 and 17%.
I saw that same article and others that say the real number is probably pushing closer to 20.
Yeah, that's what I saw as well. Yeah.
So there's unemployment, there's definitely underemployment in the living wage conversation that we've had, as well as those unemployment claims running out through the federal stimulus from those expanded dollars. I don't think that's going to hit yet, but factually speaking, we've got over 500 applications that we're processing now. So again, that just stresses the importance of the tax collections are better than previously estimated. Our thoughts was a 10% budget reduction. That's probably a revision of between 3 and 5%. If there's an income approach that was applied like it was done before, then we may see something less than even that 3%. But again, we know that the governor is going to make some announcements in the coming days. It is not substantial enough to reissue a forecast, especially about what we're going to be talking about next. So we start at that high level, start about statewide tax collections, and now let's dial into a little bit more of what our finances look like to date.
Hey, Ryan, while you're pulling that up, and I don't want to sidetrack you. I just want to toss this out there. We can discuss it later. But I'm just curious, and I know that that Dr. James has had some comments around this as well, as far as the cost for masks and things like that, and cleaning and whatnot. I mean, have we begun to think about, as we sort of project forward, what the additional cost would be, under various scenarios of bringing kids back to school in limited ways? And again, that's not for today's discussion. I'm just asking. I'm just kind of asking as you're pulling up this, that other spreadsheet.
We will be reviewing that,
okay.
So I can share with you the actual spend that we created a separate account code structure so we can track all of those spending amounts. So I'm going to show you budget versus actual, and then next I'm actually going to take you through our CARES Act expenses.
Okay.
You can see exactly what those look like, and we can start to plan for next year into what kind of budget we're going to look at. So if that's okay with you, let's start here. Does everybody see my really busy spreadsheet?
Yep.
Okay, you've seen this before. Remember, this is where we're month to month, and I'm highlighting now. This is March, this is April, this is May. Over here, these are purchase services. Remember 400s. supplies and materials, capital, and then all other. Now I'll cut right to the chase. Does everybody see over in the bottom right-hand corner of their screen?
Yeah, and then it's what, negative 5.1 million?
Negative 5.1 million. We're under budget versus actual in these components by about 5 million. So let's talk through just a little bit. We're not going to go line by line, but what does that mean, and where are those negative budget amounts coming from? So we know in some of our pupil transportation is some of the largest numbers. There's $1 million in our transportation related expense. So that's $1 million of the 5. We know some of our communications, some of our outward publications and purchase service is running under budget by about $400,000. Printing departments, reprints, test materials, those kind of things. General supplies and textbooks, as you can imagine, we're running about $1.4 million under budget. These are all things that people believe, as they sit back and they say, hey, that institution shouldn't be spending money in these areas. This is where it shows that. All other equipment, so that would be, we did purchase our buses this year. We're going to be putting a hold on our transportation for buses next year just to kind of see how this shapes out. And then dues and memberships. So a total of 5 million. Remember, our previous deficit was 3.8 million. Now, staffing, we haven't made those kind of reductions. So staffing, we might be running a little bit under budget, but as of right now, not substantially different. But the supplies, materials, and purchase services is 5 million. Now here's to your question.
Right. Oh, sorry.
No, please go ahead and stop because I can't see your.
On the capital, both the capital and any deferred maintenance that we would hold for this year and possibly next year, are we still setting aside or at least internally restricting those? Because that deferred maintenance and those deferred capital costs are going to catch up with us at some point too.
Yes, they are. We are not setting aside. So a full set aside would be us placing the money in reserve and creating our own rainy day fund. Due to our permanent improvement account mostly being used for debt service and the fact that all of our capital improvements and infrastructure updates are from general fund, we don't have the ability to do those kind of transfers, especially ending the fiscal cycle where we are going for levies in that discussion. So there's a desperate tug of war, as you can imagine, for when there's a facility update. Thankfully, the majority of our facilities are new and have some dedicated state monies to take care of them, and the classroom is we don't have that. I think you and I have had that conversation before about fiscal set aside. So they will come due and they will have to come from general fund at some point in time. Does everybody see the more simple spreadsheet on the screen now as of 6/12/2020?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So to your question, Dr. Hall, about what are we spending our money and maybe how does that translate into what our budget looks like in the future? And these are the expenses that we've submitted for reimbursement. And our return to school committee, which has, as you know, over 100 folks on it, we have a goal and purpose set of values that says we're going to protect the classroom to the extent we can through the CARES Act money. How do we do that? Well, we reimburse general fund from the federal stimulus dollars for items that we previously haven't budgeted for. And so to date, through 6/12 of 2020, we've collected, we've coded and expended 1.65 million in expenses that we wouldn't otherwise be spending. And we've submitted to the Department of Education for those costs. Remember, we have just under $10 million to last us through all of next year and into the future. One of the other questions that a board member I know asked last, I can't remember, Ms. Autry, if it was you, but it was regarding the other grants. And so the Big Eight got together and we started, if you can see on your screen, these are all of our federal grants. And we started to look at whether or not the federal guidance on these grants becomes more flexible, what kind of carryover provisions, how much money we had available, where were essential people being employed from. And so we're looking at the maximum flexibility for federal grants, leveraging those dollars first, because those will expire at a point in time, leveraging the CARES Act money second, and then finally relying on general fund third, with the ultimate goal and value set of protecting the classroom. Those were questions that were raised previously. These are some of the expense categories that we're working on. So after we close the books here in a couple weeks, tech services extended time, some licensing, technology licensing, summer school, looks like that's going to qualify. That could be a few $100,000. And then the virtual graduations, all of which we've received permission from the department to submit for reimbursement. Now we're going through the purchase orders and expenses to see exactly what we can draw from. We do have some high-level expenses to the question we received about PPE. But as you'll be hearing here in the next week or so, and post the governor's announcement, I know the superintendent's going to be talking through the return to school plan, which will ultimately determine what our supply and material list is going to look like. How many kids, I mean, just let's start at a high level assumption. We know based on social distancing and busing requirements, we know we can't educate in person all K-12 kids. Now, I think we're going to be learning more about that, and that'll put into practice what that budget's going to look like. So we're at what, just under $8 million at this point, probably with summer school, and we will, I'm sure, have seven-figure expenditures of PPE. We already have supplies and materials that we're equipping our schools with, maybe additional staff for temperature taking, badging systems for students. Those are all expense items that we wouldn't have otherwise that we're beginning to collect. I wish I had a number for you today, but I don't. But those conversations are ongoing.
Oh no, Brian, that's okay. I was just kind of tossing it out there, very softball like, if you will, just saying, hey, because and really what triggered the question was I see some of the emails that we are getting now from parents inquiring about school and things like that. I know that we've all kind of been on. It's just got me kind of thinking more about sort of, okay, well, and again, I know there's a lot of conversation that still has to happen around this topic. It's very early yet, but it has kind of got the wheels turning, thinking about, all right, well, if we were going to try to go back to school in the fall, what would some of the auxiliary expenses around cleaning and whatnot look like? I have to imagine that those costs are probably in a cumulative would be substantial. And that's not even counting kind of the costs around masks. And so the point really is that CARES Act money, would go fairly quickly. So
that's right.
is what it appears to be. That's the same, you know, that's what appears to be the case. So,
Well, Dr. Hall, you raised probably the most important point for tonight's finance committee is, so I just gave a report on CARES Act money and $10 million for us to spend. I gave a report on our budget to actual running under trend. So a listener might be on saying, well, your financial position has improved. And I think the important point is, remember, we're a $500 million organization plus. And we're talking about a couple percentage points at best. And definitively speaking, it will not change our long-term trajectory. Definitively speaking, we will still deficit spend, whether it's this year or next year, we will. And it isn't going to change the fact that it's been 8 years since we've been on the ballot. It is unfortunate timing. The timing is very difficult. But I think to the conversation, if I could even step out of my box a little bit, the worth and the essential service that we provide to this community couldn't be more true, ringing true, and folks are depending on us, and we've been nimble in providing those services. So yes, I think that was a good lead in to say numbers are running better than trend, but it is not going to change our long-term trajectory for needing operating money. So thanks for that TF. All right, next on the agenda, I'm going to go to insurance, and then I wanted to bring up Energy Star ratings for our buildings, just so that you can see that we're working through some granular level building data over the summer. So insurance rates, I'm going to bring this. Let's see, insurance rates. I'm going to start presenting again. Can everybody see that memo? Okay, great.
yeah.
All right, that memo, so effective July 1st of 2020, our health insurance rates are going to increase by 5%. If you remember from our orientation and the HVAC, the active HVAC that we have, the start of Paladina, our consolidation to one medical provider really has put us in a pretty good position to negotiate rates. We did have a year-over-year claims increase of 11%. Because of all those things that I just mentioned, as well as our cash position in our health insurance fund, which was vetted through the negotiations process, the health insurance consultant and I agreed upon 5%. It's actually what we were estimating in the 5-year forecast. Combined with the new negotiated agreements, which we've included down there, where you see the wellness, non-wellness, and the contributions, that's the impact it's going to have on our employees. This is still running better than trend. I'm very happy with this number. I would say if we weren't in the financial position, I probably would have received a lot more pressure from the consultant Oswald to push it to double digits, as well as some higher claims that we had this year. So just to recap, for the past 3 years, we've had a 0, a 3, and a 5. So I'm very happy with those trends. We'll be bringing those rates to the next board meeting, but I just wanted to summarize for you where our health insurance rates were at.
Hey, Ryan, I have a couple of questions about that, if I may.
Yes, please.
So, and make sure I heard you right. So there was an 11% year-over-year increase in claims, you said?
The claims resulted in the underwriter suggesting that you could increase rates up by 11%.
Okay, so I just want to make sure I understand that. So that was based upon. So again, he was saying, because I know that there's a couple of components. There's, a lot of times when I'm looking at my increase in cost, it can be, did my cost increase because my rates went up or because my volume of claims went up or both. So that's what I was that's what I was trying to understand. So year over year, that 11% that you referenced, what was that number? What was that number? That was a year over year increase in.
Yeah, I don't know that off the top of my head in terms of what was fixed cost and administrative and claims, but
Okay.
I can send you that detail into the group.
Okay, gotcha.
I'll tell you where the breakout was in the year over year.
Okay, gotcha. But basically, you're saying that the broker had recommended that we increase our employee contribution rate by 5%.
Yeah, well, so employee contribution, the recommendation full was 11%.
It was 11. Okay, and we only increased it 5.
We only increased it 5, and we talked through that too. We talked through the creation of Paladina and really the importance Paladina has played not only pre-COVID but post-COVID, and people are seeing its value in terms of telemedicine, right? So folks are able to see their doctors virtually in this case. So they're finding more and more value from it. So I can update the Paladina numbers for you too about how many employees are on Paladina.
Yeah. Hey, Ryan. So listen, I don't want to sidetrack us today, but I just have a question. I would like to talk more in depth about this. Again, it doesn't have to be in this committee meeting. My questions may be easily answered as a one-off conversation. Just let me know sort of how you'd like to kind of proceed with that. But obviously, I've got some more questions about some of this stuff. But again, don't want to sidetrack us today. This is good information. I appreciate you sharing it with us. But again, this is. So I'm just curious to learn more about it. So.
Well, I will follow up with the committee.
Okay.
In terms of the volume of claims, fixed versus claim-driven, administrative, show you the recommendation, and then ultimately how we got to the 5%, a little bit more detail. And then we can go from there.
Okay, that sounds good.
That sounds good. Okay, yeah, that's all easy stuff to get my hands on. Okay. I know I'm sharing a lot tonight, but all right, before we're going to kind of finish with just a conversation on the equity policy, the racial policy that we've passed, and how we want to move forward with our unit level analysis. I think those two go hand in hand in a way that Finance Committee can report back. Before I do that, though, I did want to share with you, this is something that the superintendent and I have been working on for a while, just collecting information, data, and how to move forward with tracking the efficiency of our buildings. Give me 1 second to launch. All right, one more screen here, your entire screen. All right, does everybody see that spreadsheet? Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right, those of you may or may not know, but when the School Facilities Commission, it's been, David, what do you think, about 10 years since they started something called their lead process and additional budget? Has it been more than 10 years, you think?
I think that's been about 10 years.
Yeah, okay. In the state of Ohio would increase the budget of a facilities project in upwards of 3% to do LEED certification. And that's environmental design. I can't remember exactly what LEED stands for. I can get you that. And really most of the LEED certification in terms of performance results came from building envelope, like roofs and insulation and where the walls met the roofs and windows. but most of what the LEED certification point gathering system came from other areas, like waterless toilets, and there was on-site water management, and you'd get all these credits, and you would get the scorecard, and you'd be LEED certified. Well, schools around Ohio, they didn't really track their spending. And so the state of Ohio, because there were so many buildings and millions, if not billions of dollars, actually it's more like the tobacco settlement funds were more than $7 billion were put into facility construction in Ohio over the past 15, 20 years. So it's been a lot of money. And they realized that the efficiency of these buildings weren't great. So they started with LEEDs, and then buildings were slow to adopt kind of how to track the spending. It first started, and Dr. Hall, you and I had a quick conversation about this. It first started with spending per square foot. And really that was a start to the conversation. If we're going to compare ourselves to other buildings across the nation, we needed to start going towards consumption per square foot. So we could be relative to other buildings around the country that would be smoothed for weather, whether or not natural gas is used in northeastern United States versus electricity in southeastern United States. So,
Hey, Ryan, as you talk about this, can you also incorporate how much of the decisions were local versus state when it came to decisions like when we would incorporate geothermal and when we wouldn't? Because it seems at the time that some of those decisions were driven by current market prices versus
great point.
So just curious on that, if you could incorporate it in somehow.
Yeah, and then the superintendent has a lot more information than I do. So David, jump in and stop me there.
No, a lot of it was based on market conditions. When I used to buy the natural gas for the district, that was one of the considerations for going geothermal versus not going geothermal, plus some site conditions. There are some sites where it was difficult. You didn't have enough land because we're an urban district. Many of our sites have put in the well field for geothermal.
Thanks.
And so those were largely local based on the physical footprint and then current market prices and things like that.
Exactly.
Okay.
I mean, the state had a lot of input on those decisions, as they did with most of them regarding our CLCs. But in the earlier days, it wasn't so much about the geothermal system that came. Maybe they were looking at LEED, but some of those things with geothermal happened when we had some spike in gas price, but then they started going down. So it wasn't financially appropriate to go that route in some of the buildings.
Okay. And you don't have to add anything. I just picked on geothermal just because it was the top
Yes.
of my head, but I guess I was thinking in terms of all energy efficiency, whether that was lighting design or geothermal or windows or, any of HVAC, but I was just curious how much of it was local versus state, but thank you. Sorry, didn't mean to derail.
No, and I think that's a good question. Then just also to me, I think my vocabulary in this space is somewhat limited. The lens through which I understand it is sort of three terms I can define, and really the terms around sort of the cost of generation, distribution, and supplying it, right? And so just so Ryan, I don't know, as you sort of talk through it. I think from a choicing standpoint, don't we only choose who supplies it? We don't choose who generates or distributes. That's not, we don't control that. We control who we choose as our supplier. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
That's correct. And we go out to bid, we use a broker, it's competitively bid. And as superintendent mentioned, obviously the pricing of that has driven some local decisions in terms of geothermal or site-based management. And there's a lot of different components that go into the actual expense in our buildings. But interestingly, when you talk to the Facilities Commission and their 20 plus years of experience, one of the most litigated areas is building envelope. what I mean by building envelope is windows, doors, walls meeting roofs, insulation and roofs. And so it's, I think David and I recognize that those are hidden sunk costs that we could work on. And you're going to see some of the progress that we're making, that we can again shift operational dollars to instruction by just working on some of the controls in the building, working on insulation in the buildings, making sure that there's set points of when buildings warm up and cool down, and when lights go on, and all of those kind of things. So let me take you through the ranking, and then it's a good place to start. It's not up-to-date information, but then we'll have something to share here in the coming couple months. These are all of our buildings, and they're ranked. You'll notice between 2018 and 2019, the highlighted part of your screen, that the scoring system changed. It became much more difficult. It's a scoring system based on consumption of 0 to 100. And Energy Star, I believe, is at 75. And I'll start to get you some of the specifics, but they're ranked in the district from least to best. And so you can see a lot of our CLCs who were in the 90s are now rated in the 70s, 60s, and 50s based on that scoring. So the goal for the committee is we're going to update those numbers. We've also been retrofitting, and Superintendent can talk more to this if there's questions, but we've been retrofitting all of our buildings with higher technical controls. So we are no longer just flipping a switch to cool the building in total. You're zoning places, you're having light sensors installed, more LED fixtures, and that's driving the real consumption numbers down, thus, moving those dollars to instruction. So I think it's a really good effort that we're taking. But
Hey,
I did
Ryan,
want to start with bringing our data.
Hey, real quick, and this might go back to the consumption point and the part about people about the set points on heating and cooling and the lights up and down. But I did notice that some of the schools on that, most of the schools on the list are are newer buildings, brand new buildings.
Right.
And I noticed that Firestone Park had a higher score than a bunch of new buildings, which, if I'm reading that right, that's remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah, right. So the key component there is electricity. So electricity
Right.
in a big chilling, cooling factory to cool building. And that's where the more academic component to this comes in, is to say, well, if it's just expense per square foot, of course Firestone Park is going to be less expensive to operate because we don't have air there.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that's where we have to kind of normalize this conversation across like buildings, and knowing that it is more expensive to operate these buildings with air conditioning.
Mm-hmm.
So we ought to be as conscious as possible. We ought to go for the best price that we can on natural gas every year, and put controls in our buildings so that it's just not turning every light switch on in the house when you come home. So it's a great point. All right. All right. So I did want to honor what we had previously talked about pre-COVID about this committee, saying that we would start with legislative, we'd go to district-wide financial information, and we'd go a little bit more detail, granular data. Now, I know your direction wasn't on utility spend. I know that's what it wasn't there. It was more on instruction per pupil of this building versus that building, but obviously that really got sidetracked with the fact that we're not in person right now. The mechanism we have in place is definitely able to do that, and I think we are starting. But I did want to turn it back over to you to finish as it relates to the resolution that we passed Monday night, our equity policy, just to give you an opportunity to talk through. Finance Committee is a great place where we can give data back to the other committee structures and the board about how that spending rings true and how we are spending those dollars equitably, how we're utilizing federal and state dollars equitably and for the classroom. So just want to make sure that I capture the intent of some of those comments, and that we keep on going with that in our finance committees. Any additional comments?
Ryan, just one on the equity piece. If we're talking in terms of equity, where it's what's, not equal, not equality, but equity, you have some really great charts where it talks about sort of the spending in each building and all of that. Do those charts, but I don't know if I've ever seen those charts also track relative need, so that when we're having a conversation about equity, that we can see that there's a building with the highest need that may also be getting some of the most resources.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe, and I don't know if you had planned on sharing any of those today or maybe in the future, but it'd be interesting to be able to have that context around the spending piece.
I think what we could do is, even though we don't have this last quarter of data, when we close the books and into July and August, we should dedicate kind of one finance committee, if there is a slower time right now, which doesn't seem to be in anybody's vocabulary. It's not slow by any means. To look at the year in review. So to your point, Mr. Bravo, I think we can do that and say, based on need, what is our expense per pupil? And we'll put it in terms of a ratio that I think makes sense.
Yeah, this is Derek. If I could just jump in. To me, the one thing I struggle with, and maybe it's because I'm a newer board member, but I struggle with sort of how we define need. Are we talking, is it need based upon sort of socioeconomic makeup of a school? Is it need based upon sort of, performance around standardized tests? Is it need around disciplinary issues? It could be a composite of all of the above, plus others that I haven't mentioned. I just want to make sure that I have a good grasp on when we say need, because because you can't get to equity if you haven't fully explained or have a good understanding of sort of how you're defining need in the first place. So that's where, as we sort of move this dialogue forward, I think that's where me as a new board member, I think I need a little more education and some tutoring as to sort of how we're defining it. Because again, I think if you talk to different folks in the community, there's a high likelihood that they're probably defining need a little bit differently across. Every person is going to have probably a different viewpoint on exactly how you even weigh those various factors to kind of get to an overall need score, if you will. Mm-hmm. So that's where, I think as we sort of unpack that conversation, I'd like to understand sort of how we quantify need sort of at the building level. So,
okay.
Booked over. And again, kind of a buildings here, right? But like Booked versus Kenmore Garfield versus Ellet, right? Firestone versus Booked, again. And this is where, to your point, Ryan, about sort of looking at sort of the building district and then kind of building level. I think that's probably where the gap in my understanding is probably again sort of how we define need at the building level.
But Derek, your question is timely, and honestly, I don't think there's a gap because this is something that we've been working on, I think, for the last couple of years. But similar to the energy efficiency question, I think it sounds like, or at least the question I ask is to sort of norm that conversation in the same way that we're norming energy efficiency, which is to put some context around it. I don't think we've ever defined what that need is. I mean, certainly if you're talking about I promise or something like that, we've determined what need means, to your point, which is, students who are at risk or in the lowest performing, 5% or something. But when we've talked about equity and we've looked at the charts on per pupil expenditures per building, we haven't necessarily put that context around it. And, you know, just to add this for just arguments or discussion's sake in the future, no matter how we determine need, there's as much probably art there as there is science, and it's going to be a little bit subjective, and however we define it. So, you know, there's always someone who's going to take exception to that, but we can probably find some way to say, you know, whether, and to your point again, it could be free and reduced lunch, it could be standardized test scores, it could be students at risk, it could be some metric we already have out there. Whatever that is, I don't know, but it would just be interesting to see some context around the charts we've seen before. But timely question, because we haven't gotten there yet.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's perfect that you kind of bring that up now.
Yeah, and certainly, Patrick, to that point, I mean, you know, I'm sure there is some, correlation is not causation, but I'm sure that there's probably some correlation, if you will, between, the examples you gave around students at risk or socioeconomic or standardized test scores or whatever it was. There's probably some correlation there amongst those sort of disparate factors. But I would love to sort of have this conversation in more detail as we move forward. I mean, and perhaps other districts have maybe found, so quick aside, in healthcare, we have a risk score, and Diana, Ms. Autry knows this. We have a risk score that each patient sort of has assigned based upon a plethora of various factors. Some of them are socioeconomic and whatnot. Some of them are looking at comorbid conditions, and you get a composite risk score, and then that risk score sort of tells you, gives you a data around, okay, what sorts of interventions should you be putting in place for that particular patient. I know at the I Promise School, it sounds like we've employed that type of model with respect to the I Promise School, but would love to be a part of having being engaged in a more robust dialogue about how we sort of roll that out more at the district level. And I know Ms. Autry's asked questions about this before. I heard her ask multiple times around, hey, let's understand, which schools are priority schools, and and what we're doing in those schools, and how we determine what dollars are spent in our priority schools versus our non-priority schools. So again, I think many of us have already sort of weighed in, and to your point, Patrick, have tried to help tee this up in various respects over the last couple of months. But again, I'm looking forward to being a part of this conversation moving forward.
And I think we would have already been there with Forecast 5 and the modeling that I started to show you. We would have already been down this road if it weren't for the last few months. I really do, because we started showing you per pupil spending, what building
right.
a higher proportion of special education. We can track economically disadvantaged. I mean, we were probably on track to have a more substantial conversation. So it's, I think as we close the books and hit the reset button for the next school year, that's, I think we can deliver. I know we can.
So I have a comment. So certainly education and all the different aspects of that is given when we're talking about equity. I think those areas are going to be more easy to identify. So I'm thinking about conversations I had as I was running and just my experiences before I became a board member. I'd like to see some conversations around our sports facilities. And just how that looks, our investments, because I look at it as a co-curricular. Whatever we do is an investment. Again, conversations, feelings of inequity, perception is reality. Of course, you guys have a more intimate knowledge and understanding as to why certain schools got certain things. I think it'd be a good idea for us to explain those things in terms of equity as we're moving forward. And are we doing everything that we can do in terms of our sports facilities in the district? So I just wanted to add that, because I think that's something that's talked about a lot at the high school level, especially.
Yeah, we can, spending per pupil isn't just academic, right? It'll be all funds. So we can definitely take a look at that. Okay. that is all that I had on the agenda tonight. Is there any other requests? So my homework for you and to the rest of the board is to get an Ed Choice update. Obviously, all this will be written for the Finance Committee board members to start. As we start to close the books here, and you'll hear me reference that because we got to close the books, get ready for next year's audit in the next few weeks, which is why we're having the June 29th board meeting. So we're going to start to look at what is the relative need and kind of that ratio across all district buildings, clusters, defining that need in a little bit more granularity. And then the third item that I had, as well as all spending, right? So it's not just academic, it's co-curricular, it's all spending there. And then third homework item was a little bit more detail in terms of our recommendation for health insurance claims, how those numbers were arrived at. I think that was it. Okay. If I didn't miss anything, let me know or give me a call offline. I'll be more than happy to add. Mr. Superintendent, are you good? Mr. President?
Yes.
Committee members?
Yeah, we're good. Thanks, Ryan. I appreciate the time.
Yep. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Yes.
Ryan. Appreciate it.
Have a good night.
Everyone.